Hey folks, I'm back. I'm inside and I just found an interesting article with Aurther. The guy have a book, Scenes from a Slow Civil War. He talks about America, what's going on in America right now, political, the movement there, far right, he talks about. And it's very interesting. I got a part of his stream. It's from the Majority Report I subscribe to, and I got a part. This is from a couple of days. Oh, this is from maybe a couple early this week, late this week, and I got this, and it's interesting. I've been listening to it, and I thought I wanted to share this with you guys, because this is very interesting what he's saying. Talks about Trump. I didn't finish all of it. I saw most of it now, but this is the interesting part from here. I think it's more interesting. From this part, it's more interesting, and the latter part of this, I don't know what's going to happen in the end. What did they end up saying at the end? I've never seen that part, but I've seen up to more than half of it, at least 30 minutes of it. But I want to just show you guys more of the most interesting part, I think. Anyways, here we go.
In their school list. When other times in history, and I say it'll never happen here, who could have imagined we get to this point? To those who say, oh, Civil War, that rhetoric is too much. They have two answers. One, I've been driving around the country. I would have said that before that too, but I've been driving around the country the last 2 years. It's not even a question anymore. I say Civil War to folks. And the answer is always yes. It's just when and whether they're looking forward to it. But I would argue there's already casualties. You
know what they say? Bernstein mentioned this years ago. New York writer, Times writer. It is a cold civil war. He would always mention this. Anyways.
The second to last chapter, the penultimate chapter of the book, I drive around Wisconsin after.
Well, he used to write for the Times. I don't know if he writes for the Times now.
The fall of Wisconsin became the only blue state it reverted to 1849 law, the only blue state to completely outlaw abortion. And I was in Wisconsin with my own child. I write about this with their permission. My 13-year-old, who is a queer, non-binary kid who is suffering, like so many kids are now, mental health struggles. And how do I tell my kid not to be paranoid, how not to be afraid, when half the country is passing laws against them? When their schools is holding strong, the schools around us in New Hampshire are taking down every rainbow, whether or not it has to do with pride, for fear, when there's a hotline in which you can report teachers.
Yeah, this thing is all complicated. This issue is complicated. You know what I mean? Very complicated. Anyways.
And when they read the news, my kid follows the news, they hear about women bleeding out because they don't have access to reproductive rights. These are casualties. These are casualties of the slow civil war. I think the attack on trans is going to escalate. I will say I don't think it stops there. And I think, if we look at Trump, just the Trump era alone, right? 2016, he comes in with a Muslim ban and he moves to undocumented folks. And then he adds trans folks. He never drops any, he adds. All along, there's the media, there's us, because we're the perfect enemy with it, because we look like anybody else. Your own child could be a journalist, you never know.
Right.
And of course, the rising tide of anti-Semitism, which I don't think enough is spoken.
Here's your story, let's begin. The world is fine, come on, dive in. The future's here.
And all the rising tide of anti-Asian hate, they're adding. And I think there's still some liberal folks who make this mistake. It's the oldest mistake, right? They say, oh, it's just terrible what's happening to those people, right? It's terrible what they're doing to trans people. There's some good-hearted people who says, well, it's not my place because I'm not on the front lines. You're alive, you're on the front lines. Fascism, that's what fascism is. It's a cult of innocence that thrives on death. Um, it's coming for everybody. It comes for fascists themselves. No one will be protected. I think about around here, we're close to the Canadian border, so the Border Patrol started putting up checks on the highway, maybe further away than they were legally allowed to. And we looked at all the white folks, the white American citizens, indignant, right-wingers, indignant, outraged that they were being forced to wait on the highway. Well, of course they were. Did they think this authoritarianism was going to somehow set them free? It won't. It comes for everyone. And with trans folks and trans kids, I think that's another old labor song. Which side are you on? Florence Reese from Striking Miners in Kentucky. That's a which side are you on moment. And the folks who say it's complicated, do you stand with the men who have AR-15s outside of schools, hospitals, libraries, or do you stand with the defenders?
There's an analogy too with just Trump personally in terms of like those around him. He'll eventually eat all of them and bring in new people. I mean that's basically what's happening. So
yeah, it's so funny.
Give us a sense of what you're not using civil war as a metaphor, and so give us a sense of like how you think this manifests itself, if or a sense of how the people you spoke to, and we should say like and then I want to get to Ashley Babbitt too, which the sort of where the title of the book comes from, but as you're talking to all these people, and it's almost an ethnography on some level. As you're talking to all these people, what do you glean from them as to what a civil war could look like?
I think what they think a civil war looks like is imaginary, right? Just there's a new excerpt up from the book up on Vanity Fair today. Guns are what matters, right? And there I was in Rifle, Colorado, the afternoon Rifle, Colorado, at Warren Bobert's Shooter's Grill, which is like Hooters but with guns, waitresses in cutoffs and carrying giant sidearms. And I ended up having a lunch. I mean, it's all sort of kitsch. Fascism is kitsch, and I think that also confuses people. They think it's silly and funny, and therefore it doesn't matter. So I had a Glock 9 hamburger, did it? Guacamole, or as they call it there, guacamole. I had a Glock 9 hamburger with a militiaman. And on the one hand, here's the good news, right? This guy is well armed, and he kept saying, "We're going to rise up. We're going to rise up when they come for our guns." Well, first of all, the Biden administration, I don't think any American government is going to come and take all the guns. That's not going to happen. So great. Meanwhile, this guy believes that Democrats are actually eating children. Well, if that's not enough to get you in the streets, maybe you're not coming out. I don't think.
And we should just say, literally thinks that Democrats are eating children. Like like top leadership is eating. He's full like QAnon, Pizzagate, whatever that sort of.
And he's not mentally ill, and he's not stupid either. And those beliefs are common. And I almost guarantee you, wherever you are, you may not know it. It may not come up in conversation. You know people. You may even have friends who hold these beliefs. In Wisconsin, Marinette, Wisconsin, I spent some time in the home of a leader of a militia, fairly large militia, an arsenal of guns. And he says, and that's only the legal stuff. And he was a J6er. He was streaming footage on his TV of his own footage he'd taken at J6. When does the Civil War start? He says, when the feds kick in his door. But what does he imagine? These are guys who've seen Red Dawn one too many times.
Right.
To say one time. They imagine, up in the hills, they imagine this heroic resistance. Some of this, I'll say, is on the left too. I hear leftists saying, I'm not afraid of these guys because we're arming up, the John Brown Gun Club. Or I hear liberals say, well, these militias are in for a surprise when an F-16 comes.
Yep, it's happening on the left.
And yet, I think maybe one of the most important and overlooked pieces of opinion journalism recently was in the Washington Post, three retired generals speaking to the fault lines within the military. And this is something I've reported on fairly extensively for previous books. Um, uh, where is the situation? The militia is not going to come marching. There's not going to be Red Dawn in New York, or that movie, Texas invades Bushwick. That's not happening. Uh, all of these things are sparks. That's why it's a slow civil war. As the real Civil War, by the way, was a slow civil war for a long time before it became a hot one. It may never blow up. Nothing is inevitable. Inevitability is the politics of fascism, where it may become something like Northern Ireland. Or we may get a spark where a base commander doesn't know who's really president. Do I believe Trump is president, or do I believe Biden is president? Whose orders do I commit? Do I follow? Um, uh,
That's very scary, folks. Imagine the next election that could happen. I don't know. Very scary.
there's enough base commanders, and I've met them and interviewed them, senior officers who are full QAnon kind of folks.
Full QAnon base officers, military bases in America. And that's where your coup could start, where your civil war could start. Anyways, I guess from a base in America, some military base, random military base, it's possible. It's scary. And don't forget they have nuclear nuclear weapons. The U.S. has. This could be very dangerous. And how about the enemies of America, China, and Russia? What will they do with this? If it really becomes a civil war, so-called civil war.
For that to become a very volatile situation. The chain of command in America is actually quite strong. That's good news. But what if you don't know where the command is? Then we're looking at something far more terrifying. I don't think it'll happen. But not because the center will hold. The center hasn't held. I think because we're going to slowly organize our way into something better. But we're going to have to go through a lot of that stuff first.
Do you think it's generational? I mean, when you went around, and at one point.
And this part's interesting. It's a very interesting part of the conversation.
You early in the book you talk about Occupy, your critique is one that I think people have heard contemporaneously, that it wasn't necessarily organized for a specific ask.
Oh, that's no, I thought that was a genius of it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
I note that. So Occupy. I put Occupy at the beginning. The book begins and ends with some hope.
Right. Yes. That I was going to say.
It was like I couldn't stand it.
It did sort of feel like you didn't want to do it. Yeah.
But also because I think it begins actually with Occupy and with Harry Belafonte. And I know this is going to cost me book sales. People are like, oh, look, I got this book and it's all about this horrible time. I'm like, wait a minute, Harry Belafonte, the banana boat guy. And the reason I put him there, I couldn't stand to start with some of the ugliness, but also because I want people to remember this is a long struggle. Occupy seems like 1,000 years ago now, when it seemed like we might be on the verge of a real left shift. And remember, Occupy, as you were about to say, they famously didn't have demands, and that drove a lot of people crazy. I thought it was brilliant, and I thought it was imagination. And right now we live in a moment where the right has, I hate to say this, more political imagination than we do. Imagination is another word like social movement. traveling around the country. It's almost like fascist Americana folk art. I have a friend who's a Smithsonian curator. He says, we've got to collect this stuff. They are painting silos, billboards, 100 different flags, 200 different flags. Occupy, and artists like Harry Belafonte, who's a radical artist. The Banana Boat song, he understood that as a subversive song.
Mm-hmm.
The civil rights movement, he bankrolled it. It wouldn't be there almost without him. And he knows that they failed, and Occupy failed.
Mm-hmm.
They were defeated.
Mm-hmm.
That's not meant to depress us. That's meant to remind us that the struggle is long, that it's not a crisis. It's not the final battle. We will lose. Keep going. We need to do so with imagination and with a diagnosis that I do think is rooted in history. Harry Belafonte suggests that the way we can understand American history and race in American history is through the minstrel act, white men corking up, blackface. And he goes further and says there's ways in which we all do a minstrel act in America. That this infection of whiteness, I don't mean white people, I'm a white person. I'm a person who is white. But whiteness, white supremacy, just that's part of the undertone. And that's pulling people who would not otherwise be a part of this thing into fascism.
See? Great point. And now he's gonna talk about the Latinos and some other groups. You'll be surprised. And it's a good what do you call reasoning what's going on to these groups, like some immigrant groups and ethnic groups are caught up in this fascism.
So, yeah, I think it's important to start there.
Well, do you think, I mean, as you travel across the country, do you think there is there's reason to believe that a lot of this is generational?
Generational.
Because, I'm looking at, I mean, there was a poll by the Wall Street Journal and conducted with NORC. I don't know what NORC is, but it's a research thing at University of Chicago, and the numbers on like patriotism and the numbers on religion from 98 to 23, particularly even in the past 4 years, like COVID really did a number on a lot of different things, are precipitous. 62% said religion was very important to them in 98, and 39% say that now. And you can, in addition to there being some, like, obviously, Democratic and Republican split, there's also, it's really like an age, there's a big age component to this. And I wonder if, what we aren't seeing is sort of the white knuckle stage of a lot of these things.
I'm 50, and I heard that when I was 20, when I was protesting the Gulf War. When I was when the first time I was arrested for protesting the Gulf War, the old Quakers said, "Well, there won't be something like this in your future because your generation's going to change it." My parents heard the same thing.
Our generation, though, like, I mean, I'm a little bit older than you, but I looked around and it was like, Reagan and PJ O'Rourke was popular. I mean, it looked pretty bleak to me.
Oh man, you guys are the worst. We're about the same back, but yeah, the 80s are the worst. But I think, all right, there's a couple things there. And I think those, I'm going to say up front, I think those numbers are some of the most dangerous numbers in America because that story is one we've been taught. And that America is getting more diverse. You know what else is getting more diverse? Fascism. The militia church.
Wow. Listen to what he says, folks.
Churches I go to are far more diverse than the liberal churches I go to.
Wow.
Trump gets this. Every rally starts with a black or brown preacher, a far right black or brown preacher. The crowd is mostly, but not all white. Sunrise, Florida, I write about in the book. That crowd, I don't know, maybe half white. A lot of Cubans, yes, but also a lot of Nicaraguans, a lot of Venezuelans. The Latinx boom for Trump was very real, and it's not subsiding.
Hmm. Hear that, folks? He's getting a lot of Latinos going to the Republican Party and becoming fascist. Look at the the neo-Nazi himself, Fuentes, the leader of the movement, kind of the leader of the movement now in the U.S. I think Fuentes. So he's a Latinx there. He's a big name there. So-called people of color. Yeah, I mean.
The increase amongst black voters is not a boom, but it's real and it's significant. So that's not going to save us.
I think it's mostly black males though. Mostly black males. I think it's mostly all black males, not black women. I think black women voted Democrat, but most of they went to Trump. Most of the black vote are men or males, black males.
The young are not going to save us. I talked to some old people, but I start this story of the Ashley Babbitt story, who, by the way, is only 35, in Sacramento, California, at a rally, and which is for Ashley Babbitt, which is really a brawl between Proud Boys. Proud Boys are young. The Proud Boys, the hipsters in New York, the so-called dime square scene, the alt-right of New York. These are young artists. There's youth everywhere, but the number one reason why these numbers are wrong and why they seduce liberals and left folks into inaction is that no fascist movement has ever gained power through majority control. So if you're waiting for...
See that, folks? Right?
This majority report, if you're waiting for the majority to save you, you're going to get swept out. I'm not going to work that metaphor. You really are going to get swept out.
Well, no social movement has needed a majority, really, it seems to me, to succeed. The civil rights movement was not about the majority of Americans by any stretch of the imagination.
And when Harry Belafonte, in 1960s, he married a white woman. And because he was such a star, people don't realize that. He was bigger than Elvis. He was such a star. Everyone was entitled to have an opinion on that. 96% of white Americans, many of them presumably who supported the civil rights movement, because not 96% of white Americans were opposed to it, 96% of white Americans thought that it was wrong for him to marry a white woman, right? And yet, we did break down those laws, those so-called miscegenation laws. We didn't do it with a majority. And fascism isn't trying to do it with the majority either. That's why the three percenters are called the three percenters. They believe that they can take back the country, as they put it, with a very militant, very armed 3%. That's not possible.
The Republicans, the Republicans in general are a minoritarian party, but the fascist strain within them, they're the most vocal, but they're even smaller than that. And I just wanted to return to what you were saying about the younger, maybe fascist movement being a little bit more multicultural. The through line, though, still seems to be that, if Proud Boys are beating people up, then they're on the younger side. It's also still a very misogynistic movement and male tilted. So that's what is, I think, a through line.
That's what I'm saying. That's why I said no black voters. Black males voted for Trump. It was kind of a misogyny. See? That's what I was saying.
And it also connects with the new right, online, irony-laden, completely filled with just many degrees of separation from humanity, irony. I said irony already, but you know what I mean. Like, that's kind of the new flavor that it's taking on.
Yeah, I think this is also sort of where I'm using that metaphor of the undertow, which I encountered on Christian radio as I was driving up into the Colorado mountains. But it's a little bit like, I take someone like Ashley Babbitt, 35-year-old white woman, had been a Democrat her whole life, came from a not particularly political family, but she liked to be informed. She really kind of stood up for people.
think she was the one that was killed in the January 6th. I think that's her, Ashley Barrett.
Oh, she was like one of those folks who stands up, voted for Obama twice, and then there's this moment in her life when it's just as if she's pushing against the current of white supremacy, of misogyny. What if you just let yourself go? What if you just let go and let yourself flow into this hate? And then because we do have social media, why, there's Andrew Tate and Joe Rogan and Alex Jones waiting to catch you and carry you, right?
Yeah.
There's a chapter in the book on the ugliest right-wing movement I've ever encountered. They're not the most powerful, except in as much as they shape so much of it. The MRAs, the men's rights activists.
Huh.
And every other right-wing movement I've ever written about, I go because they're more interesting than the liberal caricature.
Yeah.
They may be nastier, but they're more interesting. This is the only one that's dumber than his caricature, and his caricature is dumb. And yet, to my horrible dismay, some of the most vocal people within that movement are the so-called honey badgers. They're the women who have embraced this misogyny too. I mean, misogyny is a disease that afflicts us all as this white supremacy. And I think, yes, when we speak of
It's
youth,
good. They call this system, if we call this correctly, white supremacy, this whole system. And people get offended by him saying that, other white people saying that. When they call it like it is, that's what this is. People like TYT get offended, Anna Kasparin.
and the ways in which a lot of young people can, a little bit, to borrow a term, code switch. They can sit in my classrooms and teach at Dartmouth College and use really appropriate and progressive and thoughtful language. And then they can click. And here, the click is usually misogyny. Elsewhere, it's race. But waiting for the young to save us, that's not it. Maybe that's what matters.
Yeah. It's not very uplifting, waiting for the young not to save us. But that the young is going to save us, according to the Turks. All these young voters are going to get in, progressive voters, and they're going to be a revolution, we're going to change. Ha! See? Maybe that is a grift. Maybe that's a 20-year-old grift. Young Turks. Back to my Young Turks rant. Maybe that's a 20-year-old grift. We got this guy, Jing Yuger, used to be a Republican. So there you go.
Talk a little bit more about that click. Because as you described the undertow, like I have in my undergraduate years did a little bit of religious studies as well. And one of the things that sort of like came across in some of the stuff I did was the allure of orthodoxy, meaning that you wake up in the morning and there's like 80% less questions that you have to deal with, right? Like you don't necessarily like. I have a limited amount of like foods that I'm allowed to eat. There's certain things that I cannot wear, so I don't have the same sort of like questions that maybe it's like, how am I going to dress? I know what I'm going to be doing at certain times of the day. I know what I'm going to be doing at certain times of the week. There's just a lot of questions that I don't have to answer if I subscribe to some type of orthodoxy. I don't have to, and that's nice when you're dealing with like modernity can be exhausting, and your example of the undertow sort of like feels, or your metaphor there feels a little bit like that. Like this is
yeah.
And so what about that click? Is it just sort of like there's too many like questions and the idea of people being non-binary, or the idea of trans, or the sort of meaning that there are no hard and fast rules. You can't rely on. I think like Jordan Peterson once said, like, part of the problem is that like if you come up and I can't tell what pronouns I should use, and I can't he literally said, like, I can't start from my stereotype of what your gender is, so I don't know how to address you from the get-go.
Yeah.
And which is, you know, from my perspective, a little bit demented and twisted.
Antisocial? Yeah.
Well, not so much antisocial. It's anti whatever those genders are that he fits into boxes. But we live in an era, in a society where a lot of the boxes, a lot of the hard, fast rules are, you know, sort of like sunk down, and you have to do a little bit more work associated with it. It's not necessarily a lot, but it's a little bit more, and that can be exhausting for people. Is that the clique you're talking about?
I think it is, and it's why, for instance, earlier you said, you know, that number of, you know, the market decline and the number for whom people say religion is very important. In some ways, that's the undertow as well. You know, it's if you're engaged, maybe you go to a big Baptist church, maybe you go to a Pentecostal church, maybe you go to a mosque. There is still work and community engagement with others, people who are often different ages and so on. And those are not always conservative forces, right? The undertow of Christian nationalism, for instance, is the answers. Most of the people I talk to, none of the Proud Boys are churchgoers. They don't go to church. You know, some of these very vulgar guys, Jake.
Exactly. They're not Christians. That's a great point.
James Schmidt in what was the town? Ashburn.
They're not real Christians. You know what I mean? If you look at it, all these right-wing, these so-called Christian nationalists, or Christians they're not real Christians. They don't really go by the Bible. You know what I mean?
Michigan, I encountered really, I mean, this is a podcast and I can't repeat some of his misogynist language. And yet his big issue is we need prayer in schools. He doesn't pray, he doesn't go to church, but we need that to happen, right? Because it's a sort of simple answer. And the answer, and I think this was true for Ashley Babbitt too, who had not been a particularly religious person, but became a Christian nationalist. The answer is authority. The idea of God as authority. And then that allows you to make that switch to a person, a cult of personality. Whoever is the strong man, the one who embodies authority. Now it's easy. What do I do? I believe what they tell me what to do. It's why
it's supposed to be separation of church and state. Right? America, you're supposed to be that. And this is way into politics. See, the Christian right way gone into, started from the Reagan years, right into politics, and well, the Christian is not supposed to be of the world. They're supposed to be separate from the world. You know what I mean? Those unto Caesar be unto Caesar. Those unto God be unto God. That's it.
You know, people talk about Trump or DeSantis or any others flip-flopping, missing the point. The point is strength. There's not too many issues that Trump couldn't go about 180 degree on that his people wouldn't fall in. I don't think he could come out as anti-gun, but he could do a lot. DeSantis, maybe not yet. Maybe he'll get there. I think that undertow, that pulling you in, and I like you say, this is a time of great change, but tell me when it wasn't. You know, when I look at my classroom at Dartmouth College, which was the last of these overpriced elite schools to go co-ed, you know, I realized that when I was born, none of the women in my classroom would have been there. Right?
Sure.
And you can go back one more generation, and if there's a kid with a parent of color and a white parent, their parents wouldn't have been allowed to marry. And if you go back a little bit further, maybe their grandparent, right? A woman wouldn't be allowed to vote. This has always been a time of great change.
I'm not convinced of that. I'm not convinced. I'm convinced that there's more change now, and there's more access to the awareness of change. I can't remember what book it was that we. I think it was John Sides. I can't remember exactly, but there was a stat that just astounded me, and this is from a couple of years ago. Up until 2008, until after the Obama election, 50% of white people, non-college educated white people, still thought the Republican Party was to the left of the Democrats on race. And I think that not only and really, when you look at the last 30 years, it really has been the last 30 some odd years, maybe a little.
That's madness. So the left Republican Party. What do you say? The Republican. That's what he says.
After the Obama election, 50% of white people, non-college educated white people, still thought the Republican Party was to the left of the Democrats on race.
Non-college white people. Oh my God, that's crazy. Oh Lord, they must say they're probably Republicans. First off, most likely Republicans. One of those white folks they polled.
And I think that not only and really, when you look at the last 30 years, it really has been the last 30 some odd years, maybe a little bit more, where there have been all these changes, but the awareness level of these changes and the implications as to that is presumed as to on whose life it was, it's directly impacting you, right? I mean, that I think is I think the technology, the social media, really, where you hear this stuff and you can be targeted with this stuff. I think that it has raised a level of awareness that people have about stuff that, and being told also that it's bad. I mean, it's amazing to me what Trump has been able to do to the Republican ideology. They can barely muster any type of deficit hawkery anymore. They can't really talk about the debt. Medicare and Social Security got the whole party to publicly basically say, no, we don't want to cut this. I mean, and I think he could reverse himself in 6 weeks, and it would probably take a month and a half for everybody to follow him on that.
There's a chapter, social media. I think there's a chapter in the book called TikTok, which is a QAnon slogan, about a woman whom I call Evelyn in Austin, Texas, and part of the slow civil war, I think, is maybe listeners have heard every now and then we hear about usually a man going crazy with QAnon fever and killing his family. There's actually more of these than we realize. And beyond that, there's kidnappings and there's assaults like Evelyn's that didn't make national news, barely made local news. Local news didn't even mention the QAnon affiliation. You had to dig deep into what really happened. Young woman in Austin, Texas, kind of a hipster lefty from a conservative family in Waco, Texas, in fact. During the pandemic, lockdown, got bored, started doing her own research. And I'm sympathetic to that. There is a democratization of knowledge. I work at a college. I have access to a library. Now, Evelyn can start digging in, and she looks at numbers. She may not have the means to interpret them. She sees that number, 800,000 children disappeared every year. Yeah. This number is correct. That's a fact. 99% of them are found within hours. It's a custody dispute, or even less than a custody dispute, a babysitter who is late at home. The actual number of abductions is in the hundreds, but you got to go digging, and someone doesn't know that. So Evelyn, she sees that 800,000 number, and she goes down the rabbit hole. Preacher in Yuba City, California, I just loved. He was talking about one of the speakers. He's talking about how this guy is so powerful. He goes,
this is scary. Oh, it's probably sad.
Down rabbit holes, deep rabbit holes.
Yeah, probably sad.
Holes. He's trying to think of how to say it, and so he just says it again. Deep rabbit holes. That's Evelyn until she comes. And she's still emailing all the time and texting with her friends who are lefties about QAnon. And they think they're all having a big joke. And they don't realize that Evelyn's crossed over. And she's no longer joking.
No.
The joke is feeding her. She becomes convinced that she has to take action. She gets in her little red beat up Fiero and she goes looking for child snatchers and ramming into cars that she concludes have abducted children in them. Nobody gets really hurt.
Okay.
Evelyn's life is ruined. A couple people are really terrorized and traumatized. As I say, it makes no news. This is a person who, you're right, before social media,
no news.
I don't know that she ever would have gotten to that place. Even if she was subject to paranoia, I don't know that it ever would have been swept.
All this social media is making it worse. You know, America. America is the land of the crazy, folks. But guess what? The crazies are coming across the border, so you look out.
It's a little bit like Kanye, right? And his anti-Semitism and this debate about whether or not the anti-Semitism pre-existed that. I don't care. It's in the air now, right? It's there, available.
Kanye. You know, one time he was an okay dude. That's years ago. He was an okay dude, but not now. But before that, before the anti-Semitism, they don't mention the anti-black racism also. He spurs, and he's a black man in America, and he spurs those anti-black racism. White him and Candace Owen, and he said slavery wasn't too bad. So it was before the anti-Semitism. He got worse before that. What he said.
Available for you, or like any of the number of so-called lone wolf shooters, this manifestos, professional hazard I read, each one building on the other. That's so that like the Buffalo shooter can download the Christchurch shooters manifesto and repeat it and build on it, and then frame his like, here, I'm going to get caught.
I never knew that.
But I'm going to post this online, and they're not going to be able to stop it. Here's how to do it, and here's how you can build on it. I do think that is different now. I think you're right, and I think that's why it's why the penultimate chapter is called the Great Acceleration, which is this right-wing term now. It began as a left-wing term, and now is a right-wing term. We are in a period of acceleration.
You mentioned that you start.
Acceleration to what? Disaster.
The book with Belfonte, and you bookend it with Lee Hayes from the Weavers, who was they were a sort of a folk group, I guess, and they were blacklisted at one point. But aside from like that sense of there's a like a Sisyphean quality of like you got to keep at it, and what did you come across like any situations where people had sort of like stepped out of that world, and what's your sense of like what needs to happen for that to happen more often?
I mean, I think so wherever I've written about, so people say, why are you picking on Nevada? Why are you picking on Nebraska? Why are you picking on Wisconsin? Well, I could write about Vermont, and in fact, in a footnote in the book, there's my neighbor, Nazi Ralph. That's not a figure of speech. Nazi Ralph has got swastikas tattooed on his hands. However, he did have a big swastika on his side that, for the sake of his mother, he had changed. He's still a Nazi, but he has changed his views a little bit. He'll talk to me, but he's still a Nazi. He says, I'll talk to you. You're half white. I'm half Jewish, so he gives me 50% human in his book. I'm not interested in going to Nazi Ralph and saying, how can I deprogram you? Any more than Nazi Ralph is going to be able to convince me of his racist views.
Exactly.
The folks who are attacking my kid's school district, they're not ignorant folks. they're very affluent Dartmouth graduates, and they can't come to me and say, let us explain why allowing your child to be who they are in the school is wrong. They're not going to convince me. They're not going to convert me. And I'm not going to convert them. I'm not an evangelist. And I think this is another one of the myths of liberalism, that we can appeal to a politics of irrationalism with rationalism, a politics that deliberately celebrates and explicitly and openly celebrates myth, the power of myth, by saying, well, actually, tell me how many times on Twitter someone actually knew has really worked. It doesn't work. I don't think that's the answer. I think the answer is stepping up, building beautiful things that we want to be a part of, beautiful things that speak to everyday people, right? And I'm an all hands on deck guy. I don't, I'm not going to tell Antifa to stand down, and I'm not going to tell someone who says, hey, I'm going to get involved in the race for the Supreme Court in Wisconsin, vitally important right now. I'm going to get involved in electoral stuff.
Antifa's not.
Arts, that's why I begin and end with song, right? That's important too. Young people, there are some hopeful young people in this book. Go to town of Black River Falls, Wisconsin, after road, drive in, down the bridge over the Black River. This group of young women, queer kids, and, holding signs. And my favorite is a cheerleader, Peyton, a cheerleader with the Black River Falls Tigers. This is a small town. These are not hipsters. And she's holding a sign that says, I can say this on this show, right? She's holding a sign that says, fuck off. And the fuck off is to you. It's to me. It's to us folks who failed, who let Roe fall, right? The older generation who didn't organize enough, who didn't take the threat seriously enough, who didn't fight hard enough, who are handing to her a world and
Is it the people, or is it really the politicians? Democratic politicians, people in power that fail the people. I think that was more of the people. The politicians fail the people in this case. So I don't think it was, it wasn't the activists.
in which her possibilities are profoundly circumscribed, right? When I said to these kids, and where I've been talking to people talking about Civil War, I thought they'd be surprised. They were lovely square kids, student body presidents and so on. They're like, yeah, we're ready. Now, what they meant was they were all armed, Wisconsin rural kids. They all knew how to shoot, except for their leader, who was an archer. She was their Katniss, like in Hunger Games. But
this is serious, folks. Yeah. Oh my God.
And no, it's not Red Dawn for them any more than it is for the militia guys. But I like that their heart is there, and I like that they know that the struggle is there, and that this is not, democracy is not something you have, it's something you have to go do. It's not something you preserve and put in a jar. It's something you have to make that they would be the first to say we haven't fully made yet, right? That, I think, you want to talk about younger generation, those are the folks I look at and see some hope in.
Well, Jeff Charlotte, professor of English, Dartmouth College. The book is The Undertow, Scenes from a Slow Civil War. We'll put a link to that at majority.fm and on the podcast.
Okay, folks. Oh, it's a long video, but interested. And that's the rise of fascism in America in a nutshell, I guess. Well, I don't know, that's doesn't seem too good. Well, his book painted this America as going into like a civil war, and it's gonna be like really violent, probably. I mean, speaking about a rogue general at a base, at a military base. Huh. That's kind of crazy. But folks, that's it for this, and I'll talk to you in the next video.